Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? This time we're heading back to 1998-99 to explore the world of Indigenous peoples.
Ooh, sounds fascinating. What's our source material this time?
We'll be looking at excerpts from the Indigenous World 1998-99 report.
Ah, the yearly publication from IWGIA.
Exactly, the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs.
For those who haven't encountered IWGIA before, they're a human rights organization.
Yeah, and they've been a crucial voice for Indigenous peoples for quite a long time.
Decades, really. And their reports are amazing.
I know. They provide so much insight into the variety of issues that these communities face.
Oh, definitely. From land rights and political representation.
To cultural preservation and even environmental protection. It's really like a global snapshot.
It is, capturing all the triumphs and struggles of these diverse, communities during that specific year.
And this report covers so many different situations, from a newly elected parliament in Greenland.
To some, let's just say, interesting statements from a certain Australian politician.
Oh, we'll get to that. And there's even a section on Indigenous women uniting across the Americas.
Really fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
And, before we dive into all that,
Yeah.
it's worth mentioning this particular report is dedicated to Andrew Gray.
Oh, right. Andrew
Gray
Gray.
was an advocate who dedicated his life to Indigenous rights.
And tragically passed away during a trip he was taking for IWGIA.
Yeah, it's a poignant reminder,
Definitely.
Yeah.
Of the dedication and, the risks involved in this kind of work.
For sure.
Okay, so let's get started. The report begins its journey in the Americas.
Okay.
And right away, we're hit with a pretty heated debate.
Oh, what's that?
The Mucka tribe's whale hunt.
Ah, in North America.
Yes. This event really grabbed the media's attention.
I remember that.
But the coverage, well, it often lacked the historical and cultural context.
Right, because for the Maka, whaling was more than just, hunting.
It was deeply intertwined with their identity.
Exactly. A practice that had been reinstated after a 70-year hiatus.
But some media outlets, they focused on things like Maka youth not enjoying the taste of whale meat.
Oh, I remember that. Trying to suggest a disconnect from their own traditions.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of how media narratives can shape public perception.
Absolutely. Sometimes to the detriment of, actually understanding complex cultural practices.
While the Maka were dealing with that controversy, another indigenous group in Canada was facing its own challenges.
Okay, which group is that?
The Lubicon Lake Indian Nation.
Ah, yes.
Their situation really shows how complex land rights and self-determination can be.
For sure. The Lubicon were engaged in these land claim negotiations at the time.
Right, but defining who actually qualified as a band member became a major point of contention.
Oh, I see. Because the number of eligible members would directly impact the amount of land offered?
Exactly. It became a very sensitive issue with, very real consequences.
Right, because it's not just about the land itself.
No, it's also about access to resources and services.
Which further complicates the whole situation. And speaking of resources, another challenging case in North America involved the Western Shoshone.
Yes, and a proposed nuclear waste repository at Yucca Mountain.
Now, this goes beyond just a simple, not in my backyard kind of protest.
Right. This is deeper than that.
The Western Shoshone had already been subjected to, extensive nuclear testing on their territory.
During the Cold War.
Exactly, leaving behind a legacy of, environmental and health concerns.
So the idea of a nuclear waste repository just felt like adding insult to injury.
Absolutely.
It really makes you consider the concept of environmental justice.
And how certain communities bear a disproportionate burden.
And unfortunately, the impact of industries on indigenous communities isn't limited to North America.
Sadly not.
The report also talks about South America.
Okay, what's happening there?
The construction of a power line between Venezuela and Brazil raised serious concern.
Ah, yeah, large infrastructure projects.
Often touted as progress, but can have unintended consequences.
In this case, the indigenous communities living along the proposed route, they were really worried.
About a lack of consultation.
Yeah, and potential environmental damage, not to mention the impact on their traditional ways of life.
It reminds us that development shouldn't come at the expense of people's rights or the environment. So we've seen some pretty heavy challenges so far.
Yeah, for sure.
But the report also points out some positive developments, like the growing autonomy of the Inuit in Greenland.
Oh, that's good to hear.
In 1999, they elected their youngest ever parliament.
Wow.
It was a new era for the Inuit and their self-determination within the Danish realm.
A powerful display of their commitment to shaping their own future.
Yeah. But then just across the way in Norway, the Sami people were facing a different kind of struggle.
Oh, what was happening there?
The Sami Rights Committee released a report on land and water rights in Finnmark.
In the northern region of Norway?
Right. And their recommendations, especially a proposal for a Sami land administration, it faced opposition. Opposition from groups like the Finnmark Fishing Association.
Ah, I see. They were worried about losing control over resources?
Exactly. It just seems like control over land and resources is a constant theme.
It is, impacting so many different aspects of indigenous life.
We've seen a bit of North and South America, even dipped our toes into the Arctic.
Yeah. Where should we head to next?
Let's shift gears and head over to the Pacific and Australia.
Sounds good. Lead the way.
All right. So in Australia, the political climate around Indigenous issues was, well, pretty volatile. Pauline Hanson, a controversial political figure, made headlines with her statements about Indigenous communities.
Yes, I remember her.
Her remarks about Nunavut, Canada's newly established Inuit territory.
And her opposition to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, too.
It really stirred up public debate.
For sure, because it seemed to reflect a kind of deep-seated prejudice.
That many people found very concerning.
Absolutely. And her stance on these issues certainly had an impact.
Further marginalizing Indigenous voices in the political landscape.
Yeah.
It's just a stark reminder of the challenges these communities face.
When their rights are seen as a threat by those in power.
But amidst all that negativity, there was a little glimmer of hope.
Oh, what's that?
The Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation issued a formal apology to Indigenous Australians.
Wow.
Acknowledging the impact of colonization and the ongoing struggle for justice and equality.
It's symbolic, sure.
But it was a significant step toward healing.
And reconciliation.
It was a powerful moment of reflection for the nation. But like you said, the journey towards true reconciliation is a long one.
Oh, absolutely. Now, let's shift our focus to the Pacific Islands.
Okay.
We see a different type of challenge emerging. The impact of globalization on indigenous communities.
And that's where the economic and environmental aspects really come to the forefront.
Exactly. The South Pacific Forum, which is a regional organization, was promoting economic development.
But their policies often prioritized foreign investment.
Over the needs and rights of indigenous people.
So it was a case of, well-intentioned progress maybe having negative consequences.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The push for unsustainable development in things like forestry and tourism.
It raised concerns about the long-term impact on those communities.
And then the balance between economic growth and environmental protection.
These concerns weren't just limited to the Pacific either.
Right, it seems like a global trend.
Where the pursuit of economic growth often overlooks cultural and environmental values.
The values that are vital to indigenous peoples. Okay, so we've covered the Americas, the Arctic.
And dipped our toes into the Pacific and Australia.
We're getting around. Where to next?
Let's venture into Asia.
Okay.
There was a wave of activism and organization happening there.
Really?
The Congress of the Indigenous Peoples of the Archipelago in Indonesia was a really pivotal moment.
This was a huge gathering, wasn't it?
It brought together indigenous groups from across the Indonesian archipelago.
A powerful demonstration of unity.
And self-representation.
I bet.
And this Congress actually led to the formation of the National Federation.
Known as AMNAN.
Right. And this organization became a strong voice advocating for indigenous rights on a national scale.
It's great to see that kind of collective action gaining momentum. But sadly, not all regions were experiencing such positive change.
Unfortunately not.
The report highlights the situation in the Philippines.
Where the Mining Act of 1995 was causing a lot of controversy.
Ah, right. This legislation essentially opened the door for large-scale mining operations.
On ancestral lands, often without the consent of indigenous communities.
That's a really important point. Free, prior, and informed consent.
Meaning those communities have the right to say no to projects that threaten their lands and livelihoods.
Without it, they're basically at the mercy of these corporations.
And the Mining Act in the Philippines was a prime example of economic interests being put above the rights of indigenous peoples.
A sad reality.
And speaking of injustices, the report also details the struggle of the Ainu people in Japan.
What were they facing?
They were dealing with the consequences of the Nibutani Dam.
Ah, yes.
This project had submerged their sacred sites, disrupted the Saru River's ecosystem, and displaced many people from their homes.
Another example of how development projects can have a devastating impact.
On indigenous cultures and environments, okay, we've covered a lot geographically. From the whale hunts of the Maka to the dam protests of the Ainu, it's clear these communities face a lot of challenges.
Yeah, a wide range for sure.
What about South Asia? Anything interesting happening there?
Let's head over there now. In India, there was a movement for a separate Sharkand state. It was gaining momentum.
Yes.
This region, which has a large indigenous population, had long experienced marginalization.
And lacked control over their lands and resources.
Exactly. So this demand for a separate state was their way of seeking greater autonomy.
And self-determination.
Precisely. They were striving for greater control over their destinies and a fairer share of the region's resources.
It really speaks to their resilience, their determination to secure their rightful place in the Indian political landscape. But sadly, political representation wasn't the only challenge.
What?
The report also talks about a really serious health crisis in Andhra Pradesh.
Oh, dear. Affecting the Adivasi population.
Yes.
That's heartbreaking.
It was a terrible situation with a clear link between poverty, malnutrition, and the spread of disease.
It really underscores the need for improved healthcare and social services.
Absolutely. Addressing those underlying issues is so important. Okay, so we've journeyed from North America all the way to South Asia.
We have.
Before we move on, anything from Africa we should touch upon?
Let's highlight some of the organizations that were making a difference there.
Okay.
In Southern Africa, WIMSA, the Working Group of Indigenous Minorities in Southern Africa, was becoming a strong voice for the San communities.
The San people have faced so many challenges.
Well, they have. From displacement from their lands to the erosion of their cultural practices.
What kind of work was WIMSA doing?
They focused on empowering Sanic communities to address issues like land rights, cultural preservation, even education and economic development.
Wow. Providing a platform for them to advocate for their own rights.
And shape their own futures.
It's crucial for Indigenous communities to have that support, especially when facing such systemic challenges.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in a different part of Africa, in Rwanda, there was CAUWA.
GAU.
The Community of Indigenous Peoples of Rwanda.
Okay.
They were working to address the issues faced by the Twa people.
The Twa have often been marginalized.
They have, denied access to resources and opportunities.
So what was CAUWA focusing on?
They were tackling things like land rights, access to education, and the preservation of Twa cultural heritage.
It's a great reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
Addressing the challenges requires understanding the specific contexts and needs of each community. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
We have. From whale hunts to dams to political representation.
And through it all, the resilience of Indigenous peoples shines through.
It really does.
So we've journeyed across continents, from the Americas to Asia and Africa, and it's clear that there's this common thread connecting many of these stories.
Oh, definitely. The fight for recognition and rights on a global scale.
Exactly. And speaking of global recognition, one of the biggest things happening at this time was the effort to draft the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples at the United Nations.
Right. The report talks a lot about this process.
Yeah.
For those of us who might not be super familiar with it, could you maybe give us a quick rundown? What was this declaration all about?
Yeah, a little refresher never hurts.
Okay, so the declaration was meant to set international standards for the treatment of indigenous peoples.
Okay.
It covered a whole range of rights, from self-determination and land ownership to cultural preservation and participation in decision-making.
Sounds like a pretty big deal.
Oh, it was huge. It was the culmination of years and years of advocacy from indigenous groups all over the world. They were finally getting a chance to have their voices heard at the highest level.
So powerful. So what was the vibe like at the UN? Was everyone on board with this?
Well, that's where things get a little interesting. The report actually reveals a lot of tension and debate surrounding the drafting process.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you see, while many countries supported the idea of protecting indigenous rights in general, there were some sticking points.
Like what? What were they disagreeing on?
Particularly when it came to things like self-determination, land rights, and control over resources.
Yeah, I can see how those topics could lead to some disagreements.
Exactly. For example, Article 13, which dealt with indigenous people's right to their spiritual and religious traditions. That one sparked a lot of discussion.
Okay. Why was that one so controversial?
Well, indigenous representatives, they were really adamant about the need to protect sacred sites and make sure that human remains were returned. Things that are super important to their cultural and spiritual identities.
Makes sense. I can see why that would be a priority for them.
However, some governments, They expressed concern that this could clash with existing national laws,
Oh, I see.
especially laws related to property rights.
So it became this balancing act.
Exactly, between respecting indigenous traditions and upholding state sovereignty.
Like trying to reconcile two totally different systems of values.
You got it. And that same tension played out in the discussions about Article 18, too.
What did that one focus on?
That one was all about indigenous people's right to participate in decision-making processes
Okay.
that affected their lands and resources.
It seems like a basic right to have a say in things that directly impact your life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And indigenous representatives, they were pushing for what's called free prior and informed consent,
Okay.
meaning they would have the right to veto any projects that could potentially harm their communities or their lands.
Wow. That's a pretty strong safeguard. Did everyone agree to that?
Not exactly. Some governments pushed back, arguing for a less strict approach. They favored consultation over consent.
That's the difference.
Well, they felt that giving indigenous groups the power to just veto projects could hinder economic development.
Ah, interesting. So consultation means they're willing to listen, but it doesn't necessarily mean those voices will be decisive in the final outcome?
Precisely. You've hit the nail on the head. These seemingly small differences in wording, they actually reveal a lot about the power dynamics.
It's amazing how language can be used in such subtle but important ways. Did the report mention any specific examples of countries' positions on these articles?
It does. It has this really handy table
Okay.
summarizing where different governments stood on the different articles.
Oh, cool.
You can see who fully supported the wording, who wanted minor or substantial changes, and
Yeah.
who just completely objected to the ideas behind it.
That's helpful. Sounds like a lot of back and forth.
Oh, for sure. It was a very dynamic process,
So.
with countries kind of shifting their positions throughout the negotiations.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some became more progressive over time, while others kind of stuck to a more conservative approach.
So, amidst all these disagreements, any progress at all?
Well, despite the challenges, the working group did manage to agree on the wording for a handful of articles.
Okay, so at least some common ground.
Right, which shows there was some willingness to find a middle ground.
Okay, good. So besides the declaration itself, any other notable things happening at the UN around this time?
Yeah, there were some interesting conversations about establishing a permanent forum on indigenous issues within the UN.
Ooh, that sounds like a big step. What was the purpose of this forum?
The idea was to create a dedicated space where indigenous peoples could voice their concerns,
Okay.
participate in decision-making, and hold states accountable for upholding their rights.
So not just about human rights, but also things like economic development, education, health, and the environment, all from an indigenous perspective.
Exactly. It was envisioned as this comprehensive platform.
Were there any disagreements about how this forum would actually work?
Of course. One of the main debates was about the forum's role. Would it just be advisory, offering recommendations but no real power? Or would it have a more active role in actually shaping UN policies? And then there were differing opinions about the composition of the forum, too. Some people advocated for equal representation between indigenous people and governments.
So even when creating a platform meant to empower them, they still had to deal with those power dynamics?
Unfortunately, yes. It highlights the complexities of international institutions and the need to make sure they actually serve the interests of the most marginalized groups.
Okay, so we've got the declaration, which is still a work in progress, and this potential forum on indigenous issues. It seems like a time of both progress and uncertainty.
Definitely. And throughout it all, the role of indigenous women was becoming more and more prominent.
You know, we talked about the First Continental Meeting of Indigenous Women of the First Nations of IWGIA, but I have to admit, I'm not totally sure what IWGIA refers to. Could you explain that a bit?
Sure. Abiala. It's a term used by some indigenous groups to refer to the Americas.
The whole continent.
Yeah. It's a way of reclaiming their narrative and challenging the colonial labels that have been imposed on them.
That's really interesting, like saying, we have our own name for this land, and it reflects our history and our identity.
Exactly. And this meeting in Quito, Ecuador, it brought together indigenous women from all across the Americas.
Wow.
To share their experiences, strategize, and basically get ready for the Fourth World Conference on Women, which was happening in Beijing.
Were there any other notable groups focusing on indigenous women's rights?
Yeah. The Asian Indigenous Women's Network, or AIWN, they were doing some great work in Asia.
What were they focused on?
They had three main areas: advocacy research and capacity building.
Could you break that down a bit?
Sure. So in terms of advocacy, they were actively lobbying governments and international organizations, on issues like land rights, self-determination, and violence against women, issues that disproportionately affect Indigenous women.
So important to have those voices heard.
Absolutely.
And
Then for research, they conducted studies to document the challenges facing Indigenous women in different countries.
okay.
It helped to show how gender indigeneity and other forms of marginalization all intersect.
And provided valuable data to support their advocacy.
Exactly. And
Right.
capacity building. Well, they organized workshops and training sessions to empower Indigenous women to become leaders and advocates in their own communities.
Giving them the tools to fight for their rights.
Right. And AIWN, they also recognized the importance of networking and building solidarity, connecting Indigenous women from different countries so they could share their struggles, support each other, and learn from each other's successes.
Such power in connecting with others facing similar challenges.
Absolutely. And speaking of global gatherings, we can't forget about the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing.
Oh, yeah, that was huge. Did Indigenous women participate?
They did. Indigenous women from all over the world. They came together in Beijing and advocated for their perspectives to be included in the Platform for Action,
Which was?
a key outcome document from the conference.
What were some of their main concerns at the conference?
Well, they really emphasize how their rights are connected to things like land rights, cultural preservation, environmental protection, and violence against women.
Yeah.
You know, they wanted the world to see that these weren't separate issues, but all intertwined aspects of their lives.
So pushing for a more holistic understanding of their rights?
Yes. And their efforts actually led to the inclusion of specific language, recognizing the rights of Indigenous women in the Platform for Action.
Wow. So a victory?
It was, demonstrating the power of their collective voice on that global stage.
Amazing. It sounds like Indigenous women were really making their mark, demanding recognition and pushing for change.
They were. And their stories highlight a really crucial point that runs throughout this report.
Oh, and what's that?
The fight for Indigenous rights. It's not just about abstract concepts or legal documents.
Right.
It's about real people, their lived experiences,
Mm.
and their determination to shape their own destinies.
Recognizing their inherent dignity and ensuring they have the same opportunities and freedoms as everyone else.
You got-
We've talked about global trends. We've even gone through UN discussions. But now I'm ready to get into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, let's do it.
The report has some case studies that really show how these issues play out in real life.
It's one thing to talk about like land rights or environmental justice.
In theory.
Right. But seeing how those things actually affect people on the ground,
Mhm.
that's powerful.
Okay, so where should we start?
Let's go back to South America.
Okay.
The construction of this massive hydroelectric dam in Colombia, the Ura Dam. It had a devastating impact on the Embera people.
Hydroelectric dams, they're supposed to be clean energy solutions, right?
Yeah, they're often presented as sustainable development. But the reality can be much more complicated.
What happened with the Ura Dam?
Well, construction displaced thousands of Embera people.
Oh, no.
Their ancestral lands were flooded, and it disrupted their entire way of life.
Their whole world was turned upside down.
And to make matters worse, the Colombian government and the company behind the project, they didn't properly consult with the communities.
Or provide fair compensation for their losses.
Exactly.
So it's like progress, but at a huge human cost.
It shows how important it is to consider the social and cultural impacts of these big projects.
Not just the economic or environmental ones.
Right. Because what good is a pristine environment if the people who live there are displaced and their culture is lost?
This need to balance economic growth with the rights of Indigenous communities. It's everywhere.
It is a global issue. Let's look at Southeast Asia now.
Okay.
The Orang Asli in Malaysia. They were dealing with a similar set of challenges.
The Orang Asli, remind me who they are again?
So the Orang Asli is a term for several indigenous groups in Malaysia.
Okay.
They've lived there for centuries, but their way of life is threatened by logging mining. And you guessed it, dams.
Dams are like a recurring villain in these stories.
It seems that way. And for the Orang Asli, their land rights were often ignored. They had no say in decisions that directly affected their lives.
Even in countries that are doing well economically, Indigenous communities can still be left behind.
Absolutely. Which is why you need strong laws and policies to protect their rights.
And ensure they have a real voice in development projects.
Exactly. The report talks about an organization called the Center for Orang Asli Concerns.
COAC.
Yeah. What were they doing? Well, they were advocating for the Orang Asli, supporting their efforts to preserve their culture and their way of life.
It's good to see groups like COAC stepping up and fighting alongside them.
Having those allies makes a huge difference. It's like that saying, None of us are as strong as all of us.
Okay, so we've seen the impact of dams in South America, development pressures in Southeast Asia. Is there anything closer to home, like in North America?
There is. The report talks about the Innu Nation in Canada.
Okay.
They were fighting to protect their lands and their culture from the impacts of a huge military base in Labrador.
The Inuit, they have such a rich history in that region.
They do. Their traditional territory covers large parts of Labrador and Quebec.
Right.
But for decades, they've been battling the Canadian government over low-level flight training at this military base.
Goose Bay.
Yeah, Goose Bay. Why are these flights such a big deal?
Hmm.
Well, it wasn't just a few planes. It was extensive training exercises done by NATO forces.
Wow.
And it created a ton of noise pollution, disrupting the peace of their lands. And there were environmental risks to their hunting grounds, too.
Which are essential to their way of life.
Exactly. So it was affecting their cultural practices and their physical well-being.
It's another example of environmental injustice.
Sadly, yes. Often it's the most marginalized communities that end up paying the price.
The Innu story shows us that protecting Indigenous rights requires constant work.
Advocacy and vigilance.
And the Innu Nation, they weren't alone in this.
Right. Their struggle got international attention.
Which shows the power of solidarity and collective action.
It's inspiring to see people from different places coming together to support Indigenous communities.
So we've explored a lot in this deep dive. The challenges, the setbacks, but also the resilience of Indigenous peoples.
And the glimmers of hope, too.
This 1998-99 report, it's given us a glimpse into a really important moment in the global Indigenous rights movement.
A snapshot in time.
It's a reminder that the fight for self-determination, cultural survival, and a just future is ongoing.
The details might be different from place to place.
But the themes are universal land rights, environmental justice, meaningful participation in decisions that affect them.
Those are common threads.
As we wrap up, I'm really struck by a sense of interconnectedness.
Me too.
Whether it's a dam in Colombia, or logging in Malaysia, or a military base in Canada, these stories show us that we're all connected. Our actions have consequences.
What's truly inspiring is the strength of Indigenous people all over the world. They keep resisting organizing, advocating for a better future. Not just for themselves, but for all of us.
Their stories are a call to action. They're asking us to listen, to learn, and to stand with them in solidarity.
To be allies.
So as we go about our lives, let's remember what we've learned and ask ourselves, how can I contribute to a more just future for Indigenous communities? Thanks for joining us all night.